To the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych podcast. Recently, there have been some interesting occurrences regarding and surrounding the Trump administration, and today we are going to take a brief look at Rod Rosenstein's leaving his position in the Justice Department. With me today, as usual, are Ken, our MBTI specialist. Hello and welcome, Ken.
Hi, Cindy.
And Don, our Enneagram specialist. Hello, Don.
Hi to both of you.
So, beginning our program today, I think that Don may have just a brief description of that event and the potential significance for both the Trump administration and our nation.
Well, Rod Rosenstein leaving the administration was expected. It actually happened a little bit later than some people thought. And Attorney General Barr had asked him to stay on while the Mueller report was winding down. And that made sense because Rosenstein had been previously Bob Mueller's immediate supervisor. And Attorney General Barr then was, of course, overseeing that since he hadn't recused himself as Sessions had done. So the transition makes more sense this way. In terms of a power play, there's also some dynamics going on that I'll get to later.
Ken, I believe that you have some insights into Rod Rosenstein's MBTI type, and that all sounds very interesting.
Sure, I'll just lead into this with a little bit of a retrospective. The life of Rod Rosenstein in the Justice Department was expected to come to a much earlier end with a meeting that was called between President Trump and Rod Rosenstein back, I think about 9 months ago. And it emerged that actually the opposite happened. He was kept on. And even more bizarre, he was invited to go on a plane trip with the president. And who knows how that went, but it seems that the two of them were able to coexist reasonably well. And insight into the MBTI on Rod Rosenstein, our best guesstimate is ESTJ, which would show an extremely strong extroverted thinking function. What we will see is, and we'll see this in the clip, also an introverted sensing function, which is the number 2 function, Rod Rosenstein's perceiving function, if correct. It does show an extraordinary ability to focus, both physically and also focus on whether it's people or a factual situation to study in great detail. However, since it's an introverted function, it will take time to render itself useful. And this is why in the hearing, he was very composed in the first part of the Ray hearing, the one that we'll probably show a clip of later, and was then it became a little bit more unglued later when he was kind of put on the spot, which is usually what an interrogation is like. The person being interrogated or questioned is forced into the extroverted sensing function, which is normally not a strong suit for the introverted sensor, especially if the chain between thinking and sensing breaks down for some reason. So, Don, what's your feeling on the Enneagram for Rod Rosenstein?
Well, I reminded myself that the Rod Rosenstein that we saw standing behind Attorney General Barr in the recent clips with the deadpan look on his face, the death stare, as some people call it, isn't the same Rod Rosenstein that we've seen in the past when he was in front of Congress for hearings. And I want to recall those examples of his behavior, which were pretty remarkable at the time. It's interesting how it's faded, but from a public consciousness. But there was a lot of smirking, a lot of cockiness, a lot of palling around with the members of the club that he was proud to be a part of. And Enneagram-wise, it's hard when you get into somebody that has a lot of signs of superior oriented behavior. This is going to sound like a total slight at this type, but I don't mean it that way. It's hard to escape the idea, at least, that he is an Enneagram 1. The Enneagram 1s are all about their standards of what is right, what's wrong, what's in, what's out, what's the correct way to do things in this club called Washington, D.C. So you have a lot of signs that Rosenstein was basically feeling very powerful in his position of actually being the brains behind the Mueller report in many ways, and untouchable because he's paid his dues in this club. But as Ken pointed out, we'll begin to see that unravel a little bit, and to the point where we later see a Rosenstein with a very unanimated, deadpan stare, and as basically trying to avoid looking like he's slinking out the door, which is basically what happened. So the Enneagram position at 1 makes a lot of sense to me, although I would not rule out 6 or possibly even 5. The possibility of a mental type is there because he's renowned for his ability to focus, but focusing is a very 1 trait. So 1s are famous for their ability to focus with laser-like precision. So looking at Rosenstein, I'm pretty comfortable with saying I'm looking at a 1. And he's got that 1 look about him. The face on the screen there, it's almost archetypical.
Yeah, that's sort of an introverted sensor mask there too. Not uncommon. He actually displayed that in almost for about 2 minutes straight without blinking during the last appearance when Barr released his findings. And on the redacted, I believe it was the redacted version of the Mueller report. And it was quite a study. He basically held that stare for, like I said, about 2 minutes or so. But one thing about Mr. Rosenstein is in MBTI, he would generally be repressing a very strong introverted feeling function, which is the negative side of that is self-centeredness. It's usually not a typically empathic functioning of the feeling function of the values-oriented function. It would be a little more what's in it for me. Also, the strong FI infantile function would sometimes lead to holding grudges, stubbornness, and I think that sometimes the infantile function will come out if the thinking function is stressed, and that did happen in the latter part of the Ray hearing.
Media reports are mistaken.
Sometimes, but this is what they said. Having the nation's #1 law enforcement officer threaten to subpoena your calls and emails is downright chilling. Did you threaten to subpoena their calls and emails?
No, sir, and there's no way to subpoena phone calls.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying. I'm reading what the press said.
I would suggest that you not rely on what the press says, sir.
Well, I didn't ask if there's no way to do it. I asked if you said it.
If I said what?
What I just read you.
No, I did not.
Well, now who are we supposed to believe? Staff members who we've worked with, who've never misled us, or you guys, who we've caught hiding information from us, who tell a witness not to answer our questions? Who are we supposed to believe?
Thank you for making clear it's not personal, Mr. Jordan.
And we see it also. The only other function I could address is the tertiary intuition. So that engine is working pretty well. His perceiving function is strong. He's a competent individual. It's certainly, I think, on the ethical side, not having that linkage to the introverted intuition would make his religious orientation potentially unmoored from his behavioral day-to-day life. I know that's kind of a bold or harsh statement, but my impression of him as a person is not particularly good. I don't know if it has anything to do with politics, but he does seem to be a little bit cruel in his interpersonal dealings at times, just from other little bits and pieces of news that have come out. And it may go with the type. Usually law enforcement people do have to have that hard edge in order to carry out their tasks. And one thing I will point out is that the structure of the U.S. government is such that we have an executive branch which contains a sort of compensating mini version of a judicial branch in the form of either special counsel or special prosecutor. And not sure historically how that happened in U.S. politics, but it is kind of a weakness, because if there is ever a political motive, the president basically has this sort of parasitical entity that it can't really address in its own department without being accused of obstruction of justice. And who knows, I don't know how that happened, but the weakness of that system is really being exposed here. And I think going forward into the future, this may plague every president we ever have. Increasingly, let's say the pendulum swings way in the other direction and we have the opposition party, the roles are switched. You'll still have that same dichotomy taking place, and it may render the executive branch almost an inert entity.
Well, I've got some thoughts on that, and that is that to the best of my knowledge, that this situation was really developed with the Nixon impeachment proceedings and the whole special prosecutors or special counsel that was appointed during that period of time, and that basically was a testing of the waters for what we're seeing during this Trump administration. And I believe that ultimately, because President Nixon didn't have the hand to play that President Trump has, having secured the Senate, he is not in danger of impeachment as President Nixon was, because Nixon couldn't count on the votes that President Trump can. So there was a setup there made during the Nixon administration that we're seeing playing out now. And I actually take the opposite opinion, that once this attempted coup, as I see it, it has worn itself out and has been defeated, then the executive and the judicial will probably be much more separated in the future. So I am actually hopeful that what's happening now is a good thing in terms of the separation of powers.
I will offer a kind of an interesting, maybe controversial take on this, is that the people that were prosecuting or examining this really did believe the story. I don't know if the coup accusation will hold up. We could look at it from the standpoint of law enforcement agents who felt they had a duty to investigate something which they subconsciously believed was true. Most of the people that I've come across here and just in looking at the news appear to me to be heavily oriented towards the sensing function, less oriented towards the intuitive function. I think that did come out in Dr. Jerome Corsi's interaction with, I think it was Jeannie Rhee. Dr. Corsi correctly predicted that Julian Assange would release the Hillary emails, and was accused of knowing that in advance. And I think Jeannie Rhee, or one of the people on the Mueller team, had accused him of having divine intervention, advising him of this. But kind of a telling statement that shows kind of a lack of the understanding of the intuitive function. Whereas I believe Dr. Corsi would have a strong intuitive function, would just be able to didn't need the sense data to figure out what was coming around the corner. And that's really how the intuitive function works. But the people investigating President Trump were really strong sensors, and they had picked up little bits and pieces of information that they subconsciously wanted to be true. I think the aversion to having somebody new in that presidency who wasn't part of the club. And at this point, I look at President Trump as being almost a bystander in this process. He was fully exonerated. And at this point, I'm not going to say President Trump is irrelevant, but anybody could have been in that position. Any outsider coming, whether it was maybe Ron Paul, any of the Bernie Sanders, somebody who wasn't part of the club, in the future will face that same problem of trying to crack through a group that subconsciously doesn't want them there, and will grasp any sense data that comes along as a smoking gun and just run with it.
Well, I think that those are great observations. Number one, I can't help but wonder if because we're all intuitive here, we're all N and not S, so we're not censors in this crowd. We tend to be a little bit blind to our own weaknesses. Isn't it possible that the introverted intuition could be mistaken, and that people's hunches, that there were sufficient numbers perhaps of the intuition in the anti-Trump crowd, but they just were not correctly aligned to the data that they needed, so that they actually were functioning really more in terms of confirmation bias. And I think intuition does have that weakness, whereas sensing doesn't necessarily. It's a little bit more glaring when you're misreading the data. When you tend to rely on hunches a little bit more, you can let yourself off the hook more easily. What do you think?
Well, I think a good investigator has to use intuition naturally, and the way the whole system is supposed to work is in a courtroom where intuition and sense data meet in a public forum, and that never really happened here. So we're stuck with this pendulum going back and forth between unmoored sense data interacting with equally unmoored intuitive data, and actually both sides are responsible. I think there were a number of cases on Trump supporters also having their own sort of prejudged grasping at sense data. And it's unfortunately, we'll go around the room here and make a prediction, but my prediction is that nothing happens. And I know that may disappoint some people, but and I look at Barr for a confirmation. He's kind of the man in the middle at this point, and I don't know him. Nobody knows him personally, but he strikes me as being sort of that blind, justice personality, and he's probably looking at this and kind of laughing at both sides, because they both have their well-oriented arrangement of sense data to suit their own intuitive look into the future. And when it actually does hit a courtroom, I think it'll probably be somewhere in the middle, where you have really dedicated law enforcement people who just believed a story that just wasn't the right theory, but they really did believe it. I don't believe they'll ever be able to levy a charge of treason. There are lots of people that want that to be true, but I don't think that's possible. If these people are possibly capable of that, they just were misled by a theory that just didn't pan out. I mean, President
there's
Trump.
Certainly a lot of those, but I think at the top there were people that did know, and that they skewed what was allowed in the media so that they would have the willing accomplices. But at the top, I do believe that there was some treason going on. That's that based on my look behind the scenes. That's what I think is going to come out, and frankly, I'll be surprised if it doesn't. That you've got a lot of evidence pointing to some spy activity that was basically helped along by the British spy system and the royals there. So I think that will all eventually come out. And this, in many ways, is a more abstracted version, I think, of the first American Revolution, in which we split from Great Britain. In recent decades, we've had this close alignment with that nation, and everybody seeming to think that we're on the same page about most things. But actually, underlying this has been a lot of people that have done some more digging into history have realized that some of those old wounds have never really been healed. So I think that this is going to reach around the world once all the evidence comes out, and we're going to be surprised by the level of complicity of people aligning themselves with other nations and against their own government.
Well, I think they honestly believe that President Trump was a criminal. And it's happened.
Well, there was a lot of people that honestly believed that communism was true too, and then we had the Rosenbergs that were tried for treason and found to be guilty, and I'm sure they believed they were good people.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. It's just the difference in perception. Hopefully, this is why the Justice Department is so important, that it carries out its duties in an ethical manner. And what do you think, Cindy?
I'm not sure about treason charges, but I believe that there was definitely some obvious wrongdoing with the Steele dossier, especially since it was partly paid for by the Clinton campaign. The whole idea of Five Eyes, that it's not lawful for these five nations to spy on their own citizens, so they utilize one another's spy systems to spy on the citizens and then pass along the information. Some of this is just, it's too contrary to the Fourth Amendment. It's too outrageous, I think, to pass without some kind of special footnote in history that will probably be some kind of legal action. And I saw an interesting interview over the weekend. Greg Hunter interviewed Kevin Shipp, who used to be fairly high-ranking in the CIA. And Kevin Shipp said that he fully believes and anticipates that we will see some indictments. And he said that he believes that Barr will pay them out very slowly so as not to rock the boat so much that the very fiber of our nation begins to fray, but that Kevin Shipp believes that these things that have been exposed will result in some indictments. So we'll see. And so with that, to the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, we thank you for joining us for this edition of Poli-Psych Podcast. Please click like if you have indeed liked this program. We hope that you will consider subscribing to our channel, sharing our videos with your friends, and returning to join us in the near future. Until then, take care.